Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Been a couple weeks since I've released the last chapter, sorry about that, and to make up for it, stay tuned this week because I'm going to release a pretty long chapter of content that is just not in the book. Last time we went through chapter 14 where we read about Ganon and Aaliyah as they first met in the wilderness. Ganon subsequently saved Aaliyah from getting eaten by a giant bear cat known as a grizzlynx. And yeah, so all they had to do was turn on his immune response to the suit Darkstar, and it just absorbed the bear just like that. Picking up chapter 15, The Road to Argaria. The year is 1065 by the Nocturnal Calendar. Beta. "You ate it?" Talia blurted out. "We're here," he said flatly as he shouldered Talia off with a little bit of force. "Just like that, you ate the grizzlynx. I just told you that I saved your mother's life on the night we met, and all you're concerned about is the cat." "Cat? Grizzlynx is a bear. Maybe to you." Talia looked at Ganon as she followed along behind him, and in a hushed whisper she said, "Amazing." But then she remembered the story Mathis told her about what happened to Aaron, and she thought of a delicate way to ask. "So, does Darkstar actually get energy from eating things?" "It does." Talia understood that to be the end of the conversation. She knew that what had happened to Aaron would always be on his mind for the rest of his life. The Pharos towered high up, lit on one side by Sar, and coldly shadowed on the other side that faced the crater. As they neared, Talia could see more detail of the shadowy side and realized that the entire southern portion was in ruin. Several spouts of water shot out to create waterfalls over the southern face of the tower. They surged down into the crater and out of sight to diffuse into the cloudy mists below. Talia looked on around the waterfalls as she spied groups of flying creatures that swooped in and out of the watery cascades. She had never seen anything like it and wanted to remember it well. So she looked on and on. What a place! The old lighthouse. He looked up at it, remembering. I stumbled on it when I was looking for a place to hide the power core. That's a conspicuous place to hide something, is it not? They made their way closer. Ganon just looked at her and gestured in his own way to look up. A loud screech called out from high up in the sky as several of the winged creatures caught the thermal updrafts to soar in a huge rising swirl. The call was returned by one and then another, and Ganon looked skyward as he slowed his pace, which made Talia do the same. Both of them came to a stop while their eyes were fixed on the circling flyers. Dozens joined the group. Some dove in from clouded heights, while others leapt from the walls of the Pharos, and soon the dozens looked to be more like hundreds. Less than a minute had passed when another call shot out, but this one sounded much higher in pitch, and it sent the flock into a frenzy. In an instant, all of them dived downward right for the two of them. Talia made to grab at Ganon and blink closer to the Pharos, but a rush of sound from behind took her by surprise as she felt the sharp dig of a talon squeeze into her shoulder. Talia cried out when the talons pierced her suit and dug into her. With a mighty force, a set of massive wings beat down around her and tugged her from the ground. As her cry rang out into the air, a spike of granite exploded from beneath the flying beast. It grazed Talia and knocked her loose from the flyer's grip. At the same time, the spike skewered the beast clean through, killing it. Another flyer swooped in from ahead of her, and, still on the ground, she shifted her hips, spun around on her rear, and flung a leg into the air. With a wide arc that came down, she connected with the flyer's head and knocked it face first into the ground. The Aztec scrambled to her feet and made for Ganon as she fought off a drove of the creatures. The ground beneath Ganon sank as a forest of earth and spikes shot up around him, skewering every assailant around him. His tail whipped by, and Talia reached out. A blink later, the two found themselves close enough to the Pharaoh to make a hard break for it. Some meters behind them, and also above them, the squawking beasts regrouped to follow. They were like a wall of wings and teeth when they dove on the two again. Talia dropped to her knees and grabbed fistfuls of dirt, and she flung her hands up. From both sides of them, the ground shot up and overhead to slam together in a connected arch of stone. The flyers careened headlong into the arch as Talia grabbed Ganon and shut her eyes. Another blink, and they were at the gaping hole in the southwestern wall. One more found them inside, neck deep in the nest of the creatures. "You don't really think things through, do you?" Ganon asked. Heads turned their way from every direction imaginable. The looks they received from the beasts were of confusion and mild interest, until a call came from outside. The same call that sent the first group wild had much the same effect inside, as looks of curiosity were replaced with predatory malice. Ganon urged in a quieter voice, "Get us out of here." "Hold on, let me think about that," she said snidely as her eyes met with a set of teeth. "Where to? Another nest?" she asked with an awkward and frozen smile. Growls and menacing chirps filled the echoing chambers. "Down," he gambled. "Take us down!" With a nod, Talia did just that. Thankfully, Ganon's gamble paid off. They found themselves in the darkened, seemingly emptied subterranean corridors. They stood still as they listened to the uproar going on above them. "By the sound of things," Ganon whispered, "I would guess we are 2 flights down." Talia's heart pounded, and her knees were a bit shaky as she felt the energy drain set in. "Well, I stand corrected," she breathed heavily. "This is a great place to hide something." "Are you going to be all right?" His concern carried some urgency. "For now," she said, "provided we get to this power core without any further surprises." Ganon cautiously slithered down the corridor and whispered for Talia to follow. As the two stealthily made their way through, Ganon asked, "Back there, the spikes. What was that?" "That is the flow from within," she answered. "The control over the elements, and the natural power of the Azek as bestowed upon them by Mother. It takes no effort for me to do those things." "Could you do such things to help us down here?" "If you want me to bring down the pharaohs." She thought for a second. "Sure, I suppose." They laughed in a hushed way. "So where is this power core?" she asked. "At the bottom of a cistern." The hallway turned and opened to a devastated portion of the tower that halted their advance. The place resembled more of a vast rubble pit than anything else, but they could see several levels up and a couple of levels down, and all around were resting and sleeping beasts. Quietly, they backed away from the opening and back down the corner. Quietly, they backed away from the opening and back around the corner. "Back the way we came?" Talia asked. "Wait." He peered back around the corner and slowly inched his way to the opening, and there he looked long and hard. With a nod to himself, he slipped back to Talia. "I'm pretty sure this used to be the center well. Ground level is 3 tiers up for certain, and we're in the substrata of the west wing. So where do we need to go?" "Down." The hallway darkened as Talia looked over Ganon's shoulder to see a winged shadow writhe along the crumbling wall behind him. The sound of a garbled grunt and deep sniff of the air made Ganon rear around to see a grisly maw turn the corner. Its orange eyes smoldered in the dark of the hall as there came a snarl and lurching chomp. But Ganon had already coiled himself up, bolted forward, and latched on around its throat to thrust the beast against the far wall. That was when he saw the 2 other sentinels at the opening, and they began to close in quickly. With a powerful twist, the neck of the beast broke in the jaws of the serpent, and he dropped it to the ground. Ganon made an about-face and swept Talia up in his unseen limbs to hurtle away down the hall. Roars erupted from behind them as they sped along the halls. The serpent turned here and there in a mad dash to find a way down through the labyrinthine ruins of the substrata. But when they came across yet another large hole, this time Ganon spared no reservations, and he dove in headlong. A burst of light from Talia revealed the treacherous mound of jagged rubble they fell toward, and just as quickly as the flash died away, the 2 of them hit. A plume of dust fluffed up into the air as Talia coughed and rolled free of Ganon's telekinetic grip to stand as she dusted herself off. Ganon also rolled over to rise up and shake off the soft dirt from his back and out of his quills as he pondered the mound they found themselves on. That is the finest rubble I have seen yet, he said to himself. You're welcome. Talia patted herself down some more as she walked toward an open door. Come on, while we have a chance. Plan on using that teleportation of yours anytime soon? He slithered down the mound. Teleport what? Talia looked over her shoulder at Ganon while she walked along. When you jump from one location to another, it is known as teleportation where I am from. Teleportation, she thought on it. Do others from your world have this ability? It is used through the means of technology. It is theorized that a person can do it, but no one I know of can do it, and it is another mystery about you, it would seem. Well, whatever it is called, if the current trend continues, then I think I may need to save it for a miraculous escape. When the two reached the door, Ganon pressed through quickly as he recognized the look of the tall, wide passage. He knew that going left from here would take them directly to the cistern. Talia squeaked as, without warning, Ganon grabbed her around the waist and lifted her up into the air, and she dropped onto his back. Toward their destination, they sped. The cistern is just ahead, he raced along, but when we get there, we'll need to go for a swim. I do not much feel like going for a swim. The moist air and dank smell of mildew grew as they approached the ledge of the pit. Ganon slid to a stop, and Talia jumped off to hit the ground with a solid thud that echoed around. The place stretched out in all directions except up, and the pit fell away before them, mostly empty with the water's surface far below. The two peered over the edge into the dark abyss. Talia found a rock to kick in, and she did, both of them listening for the splash, which was long in coming, but sounded deep. I wonder how much more water is down there, Talia murmured. In any case, it is a lot less than I thought it would be. A tremble in the ground made her peer even deeper. Stand back. What is it? It might be nothing. Talia and Ganon eased back from the edge. What did you see? He asked. More like felt. She rummaged around in her furs, pulled out a slender metal spike, and fiddled with the item. Again, she felt the tremble, stronger than before, and that made her stand ready to throw the spike. What is it? He asked again with more urgency. Talia only hushed him as the tremble turned to a rumble. Up the opposite wall, a massive worm crawled its way up in a sidewinder fashion. The hulking creature slowed to a stop just as it reached the lip of the cistern, and a great length of it peeled away from the wall to reach out toward them. Long, prehensile tendrils on its nose waved around in the air and stretched toward them, but it could not make it anywhere near halfway across. Soon the worm lost interest. Retracting itself, it slammed back against the wall and continued making its way up and over the lip, undulating off into the distant hall. Talia whimsically glanced at the small dart in her hand with a shrug as the huge beast wormed away. A star-nosed worm, she said as she stuffed the dart back into her furs. I'm pretty sure it knows that we're here. The rock probably woke it up. We're damned lucky that it did not smell us. Come, let us get this thing before it returns. A long set of stairs worked their way down around the inside of the pit, and for the most part they had been carved to perfection, though at points they had crumbled and fallen away. However, Ganon made it easy for Talia to cross by stretching the length of his body across when the time came. Talia? Ganon? You said that if you used the Aztec powers, you would bring the place down, but I'm assuming that you used them there at the rubble pile. I did, yet the Pharos still stands. You asked if I could use the spike above the foundations, and that is far different than turning a pile of rocks into dust. How so? Well, she thought as they descended. The pile of rubble was already in place. There was no need to gather the materials from elsewhere. All I needed to do was have the will to live, and Mother did the rest. As for the spike, it did not exist beforehand. But that's not what she meant to say. The ground existed, yes, the materials were already there, but they needed to be taken from one place and moved to another to create the spike, so somewhere else a hole will have appeared. She ran her hand against the wall. I might be able to do it down here because we're in solid stone, but if I did it above the foundations, taking materials from the bricks, then that would bring down the Pharos. They spoke together. What else are you capable of? He asked. Stuff like this? Finally, they had reached the water level, and as Taya went down the next step, even though there was no place for it to go, the waters peeled away from her and pushed farther into the center. The farther down they traveled, the farther back the water pushed to loom high up against the walls. Noisily, it sloshed along the walls while they made their way around the pit, and soon the slope of water crested to tumble in on itself. The noise of it sloshing turned to a thunder of a standing wave that churned in constant cascade. "Is all this really necessary?" Gannon yelled over the roar. "I could have just jumped from the ledge, I suppose," she shrugged as she yelled back over her shoulder, "taking you along with me since I do not know what I'm looking for. Maybe created an air bubble to keep us from hitting the water, and so we can breathe. But then we would be falling like a rock to the bottom of this place because, well, I cannot fly, and no amount of soft sand would keep that kind of fall from hurting. But it is a bubble of air. They float in water." Taya could see the bottom of the cistern only about 10 feet down and decided that now was better than later. She grabbed Gannon in a bear hug and wrestled him over the side in one motion. Both of them sailed through a pocket of air as the mass of the pool crashed back into the pit. Straight down to the ground, Taya landed with a jolt while Gannon sprawled out, his tail splashing outside the bubble. "See? Not floating. But how? Later." The voice of the Aztec had returned as the hiss of electrolysis fizzled around them. "Do you see it anywhere?" Gannon looked around. "So all that with the water was not really necessary. We could have just simply and silently walked down the stairs in this bubble of yours. I'm certain that just caused a lot more trouble than needed." "From what? That worm?" she scoffed. "They like water, but they cannot swim." "No, but those can." He pointed to the right. In the stirred silt of time, they could make out the bulk of a giant but limp and severely dizzy eel that floated like flotsam in the settling waters. "That thing was a lot smaller when I first brought it here." "Can you spike it?" Gannon asked quietly. "It's too big," she responded flatly with a double take at Gannon. "You brought that in here too?" He nodded. "You'll have to tell me about that sometime." Taya moved ahead. "Find the power core and we can use that miraculous escape." Yet she thought, "I suppose I could stick it in the eye." Though she shuddered to think of the eel getting that close. Gannon removed the shard from under his breastplate, and Taya watched as he held it out in front of him. A small chime sounded from it, and immediately there was a double flash of blue light accompanied by a loud ping in the corner of the cloudy water to their right. The eel stirred, and Taya turned to Gannon with a startled look. Then she motioned for him to follow as she moved along to where the light had pulsed. All the while she kept her eyes on the eel, for she could tell it was also watching them, just still too dazed to do anything. The two picked up their pace, though that may have been the wrong choice because when a predator sees something running, it usually decides to follow, and the eel righted itself to slink along after them. The fine silt and carcass-laden debris that covered the ground made for a slippery, stinky advance through the muck. It thickened and piled up the closer they came to the corner of the cistern. Taya found it hard to clear the mud and hold the bubble at the same time. Soon they found the muck impassable, and, as the more she tried, the more she just slipped and sank into the slop that sloshed around her feet. Gannon poised himself in a coil, wrapped so tightly that Taya could see his muscles ripple throughout. Again, the lights pulsed as the sound pinged. With unreal speed, the serpent sprung to splash out of the bubble. Up the pile of muck his bulk stretched to full length, and Taya grabbed his tail to pull her along. He reached out to the light as it pulsed, and when he gripped it, its icy feel shocked him. He had forgotten how cold the core felt in his grasp. With it, he pulled back. Gannon turned to see, with shock and horror, the eel with its massive and extending jaws chomp down on the bubble. In a blink, the two of them were at the lip of the pit, and Taya and Gannon both howled in pain as they collapsed to the floor. Taya rolled around in agony as she held her wrist and forearm in place as best she could. Gannon coiled up in a writhing mass with his tail bitten and bloodied. Seconds passed like minutes as they calmed their fits to simply lay fetal on the ground, breathing deeply and regaining their senses. "It's broken," Taya managed to force out. "In a couple places." I'll manage with mine, Ganon hissed through pressed lips. I've had worse. He looked it over. 2 superficial gashes had removed some scaling, and 1 puncture hole near the tip of his tail had bled, but now just oozed. Anything an Azek can do about this? Not here. She tucked her arm in and held it firmly to quell the pain. Focused, she slowly and elegantly stood straight up in place with a deep breath. An echo bounced its way to them and skittered as it passed. Then another. Then an echo of a screech followed by the cacophony of many screeches, flaps, and skitters as the chamber flooded with a number of the flying beasts. Ganon moved to circle Talia. We've been found! You think so? A rank, putrid, and noxious wind pushed them off their guard, and they stumbled to the side as a massive nose covered in tendrils exhaled on them. The star-nosed worm had eased its way out of an unseen passage right next to them. Talia and Ganon, out of both wisdom and fear, remained frozen in place as the worm faced them a while. Then, as it sniffed deeply, it lifted and sniffed the air all around them. The hulking beast lurched for a flyer to snatch it from the air and crashed down to crush the thing all in the same motion. The scene became frantic and chaotic as the worm began to thrash around amid all the crawling and flying creatures. Talia looked to Ganon and both thought the same thing. In a blink, they were a level above. Talia screamed. She collapsed to the floor as she shook and trembled and gasped for air. Her arm felt as though someone had taken it, broken wrist and all, and wrenched it away from her, even though she still held it safely against her ribs. She heaved and held back. I'm not doing that again. Her knees were still weak, but she leaned her back against the wall to help her stand upright, and slowly she slid up. You need to get us out of here. Ganon handed her the power core, and Talia slipped it into the pocket of her furs. He laid low to help her slip onto his back. He grunted with a grimace as she, again, gripped a handful of feathers and hoisted herself up. Gently, he made his way forward, and he picked up his speed as they went. The corridors were empty for the most part, and they slipped by the imperceptible flyers that stalked the halls. But when they came to the opening that they had entered through, a single sentry sat atop the rubble. Ganon pulled back and gathered himself into the shadows. He whispered, Guaranteed there are others just waiting for it to call out. No doubt. And the other ways out of here are? She flinched as the creature's head snapped around to look directly at her. Talia tumbled backward with her legs over her head to hit the ground with a loud yelp as Ganon bolted out from beneath her. By the time Talia had painfully scrambled to her knees, the serpent had the flyer's neck in his jaws. By the time she fully stood, he had pulled the thing back into the shadows, crushing its neck. He clamped down with such force that it almost severed the creature's head. Dead, it fell limp from his mouth and tumbled down behind a pile of bricks, where they left it as they made their way out of the Pharos. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me. We're going to leave it right there. Stay tuned in a couple days. I'm going to have a pretty long video. I might break it into 2 videos. That's how much content I've got for you of stuff that is not in the book, but it's definitely relevant to the story at hand. Thank you for all of you who have been hanging in there so far. I know there's probably only like a handful of you still watching so far. Thank you. We'll see you guys next time.